Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Lee and Bernard Jaffe Family Jewish Book Festival, and another great year of literary programming. My name is Wendy Juren-Auerbach, and I am the co-chair of the Jewish Book Festival, and I'm thrilled to be the moderator of today's author talk with Anna Solomon. If you haven't read her book yet, we're not going to have any spoilers, but we're going to tell you just enough so that you're going to really want to read her book, because I can tell you it's really terrific. Before I introduce Anna Solomon, I have a few housekeeping items. The event is in meeting format, which means that you can see all of your friends, but you will want to view the event in speaker view. If you are on a PC or a Mac, go to the top right-hand corner and click on Speaker View. You've been muted and will continue to be so throughout the program so that the audio for our guests will be as clear as possible. If you have a question for the author, please type it in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we possibly can. So now, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our special guest for today. Anna Solomon is the author of 3 novels, The Book of V, which we're talking about today, Leaving Lucy Pear, and The Little Bride, and a 2-time winner of the Pushcart Prize. Her short fiction, essays, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Plowshares, One Story, the Boston Globe, Tablet, and elsewhere. And this past May, when the book came out, it was selected as the book of the month for Good Morning America's selection, which was very exciting because I understand it was up on Times Square and all of that kind of thing. So welcome, Anna. We're tickled for you to be with us today. And just want to ask you first how you and your family are doing in this very unusual time we're having.
It is indeed unusual. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're doing, I think as well as we could be. We're sort of divided right now between Brooklyn, where we normally live, I guess, and Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is where I grew up and where I am currently with my son. My husband's in New York with our daughter. So, but I feel we're healthy and sheltered, and so I feel
That's excellent.
Yeah,
that's great. No, it's a challenging time for everybody. So we want to get started, and for I thought a great way to get started would be for you to kind of give an overview of the Book of V for people who have not read it, because it's got lots of moving parts and just actually several stories in one.
Yeah, let me do that. And I just want to say clearly too, to thank you and thank Patty and thank everybody who's made this possible. I'm really grateful. I wish that I could be there today. I wish we could all be together, and hopefully in the future something like that can happen. But thank you so much. I know you've put a lot of work into this. And yeah, just to give people a taste of what the Book of V is about, it weaves together the stories of 3 women's lives, 3 women's stories. One is a contemporary, meaning early 2016, now feels sort of a long time ago, but early 2016 mother of 2 in Brooklyn, New York, has given up her career to raise her kids, and sometimes it feels sort of she's given up a lot more than that, and she feels a lot of ambivalence about some of the choices that she's made. And then there is a U.S. Senator's wife in 1973, Washington, D.C., named Vivian Barr, who goes by V-E-E. And she is caught at a moment where she is being asked to really either, this is at the very beginning of the book, sort of either humiliate herself in front of her husband's, a party that her husband is giving, or sort of give up her life as she's known it, which might sound a little familiar to you. And if it does, it's because that story is drawn from Vashti, the queen that we meet at the beginning of the Book of Esther. The third woman in the story is a teenager named Esther in ancient Persia in 462 BCE in Susa, Persia, who is doing everything in her power not to become queen, So she's kind of living out a story that we're familiar with, but it turns out to be a different story too. And as the book goes on, so these stories are braided together, and as the book goes on, as you start to see these stories converge in the present day, you come to understand that although the questions that these women are facing are, of course, very different in many ways, and the challenges, that the questions that they're struggling with around power, around desire, around identity, around female friendships, around marriage, etc., that they have a lot in common, probably more in common than they have apart from each other. And so that's kind of the core of the book, and where it how it holds together. And it does, toward the end, you do start to see their stories come together.
I have, so before we get into all of there are a million themes in this book that are just terrific to explore. But before we get into that, what sort of sparked the idea to have the Book of Esther as kind of the jumping off point for the book?
Yeah, so I like my character Lily, who's the mother of two in 2016 Brooklyn. Like her, I was given a copy of a children's book of Esther to read to my kids. Really beautifully illustrated, it was kind of like more concise. But as I started reading it to them, and I grew up with the holiday of Purim and grew up interested in it, and interested in ways that I hadn't really realized in Vashti and sort of what happened to her. As I started reading it to my kids again and again, because they really loved this book, I realized that it made so little sense. Like, the plot made no sense. There were all of these plot holes. There were so many inconsistencies. And also, probably more importantly, the story I had been told about the story, right? So, meaning Esther is the good, virtuous, brave one. Vashti is bad. She might be wanton. Often she was dressed like a prostitute at the spiels that I went to growing up. Ahasuerus is good. Like, he ultimately means well. All of that story I'd been told about the story didn't seem to match with the story itself. And so I was really curious, and it kind of drove me back to the Book of Esther, or I should say probably drove me there for the first time. I don't think I'd ever sat with the text of the Book of Esther and read it. So that was part of it. And then I think the other piece, and this is sort of more thematic, but was another story that I had been told, that really, again, was that I was having questions about, which is, so I was born in 1977 on the heels of the second wave women's movement. At a moment that really seemed to promise, at least in the world that I grew up in, that equality had now been won and everything was now good. We had no more need for feminism. My life would be equal to a boy and then a man's life. And it really took a while, till probably I became a wife and a mother and started looking around at both myself and all these women around me who'd taken on these roles, to come to really sort of question that narrative as well. And so I would say that those two stories and my questioning of them kind of merged into this book.
Well, I love the different time periods that you picked. I thought they really resonated. And especially, they were each one, I mean, even 2016, which is more contemporary, they're very evocative of, I felt like I was really transported into that particular time period. And this is really about how much research did you have to do? Because you're talking about historical periods, but you're also talking about, I guess, going into the Book of Esther, that's not a
Right.
finite thing.
Right,
And
right.
there's quite a lot that swirls around that. And can you talk a little bit about your quest for how you gathered background for this?
Yeah. So, and it was different. I mean, this was a book where it was my method had to be very different for each period, right? So, I mean, 2016 I had lived through, and sort of had the least research to do. And then when it came to the 1970s, and in particular 1973, which was during, I didn't know when I started writing the book, I was very kind of, oh, it's early 70s. And then I pinpointed this moment that was really in the midst of the Watergate scandal with Nixon. And I don't even know if I even came to that clearly until after the election of 2016. Like, everything kept evolving. Where did this need to be set? and to really understand that cultural moment in Washington, D.C., what was going on, not just on the public face of things, right, but in people's homes, and the kinds of parties that were being thrown, and the kind of sort of license that was being given to a lot of, in particular, men at that time. And part of that came from reading, well, talking to people who had lived during that time, reading a lot of historical accounts, but as often happens, also reading a lot of fiction, reading the fiction that was set at that time, in especially things set in DC. And I had also spent 2 very formative years in Washington, DC as a reporter not obviously in 1973, but in 2001 to 2003, which, although it was a very different time period, really introduced me to that world and that culture in a way that helped me as well. As far as ancient Persia goes, as you said, I think you used the word not very finite. And I think, yeah, I mean, what was really fascinating was that as I started to dig back, so there are 2 pieces of this. One is the Book of Esther itself, and one is the time period. And in terms of the time period, what I discovered very quickly is if you start to research like Jews in ancient Persia, what you find is that everything leads you to the Book of Esther. So, in other words, the Book of Esther has been taken as the definitive history. And if you start reading the Book of Esther, you see why, in the sense that it really poses itself as a book of history. There's lots and lots of mention of records and annals and all of these different official this and official that. What I came to understand through reading commentary and through reading especially the JPS commentary by Adele Berlin, which I spent a lot of time with, she understands that to be really meant itself as part of the fiction of the Book of Esther. Now, of course, this is a controversial take, and there are people who still read the Book of Esther as a fundamental, what really happened. I really approached it as a playful exercise of imagination, and really of midrash, of the act of reinterpreting and telling new stories out of old ones, and midrash is a tradition that goes back to ancient times, right? So, Babylonian rabbis were also coming up with stories about the Book of Esther that you don't find anywhere in the text itself. And so a lot of what I did in that research process was actually learning how to go back to those commentaries that had been written before me, both ancient ones, more contemporary ones, and to start to kind of get a sense of that conversation and then figure out what I wanted to add to that conversation. I think that was sort of the biggest part. And so it was a lot of reading and a lot of coming to understand, again, sort of the traditions that I was entering into.
And so essentially what you've written is maybe could be now part of the canon of Midrash, essentially, because you've added to those stories. So how did you, so you did all of this and you thought, and Vashti, did Vashti just sort of jump out at you as someone who was an interesting character who maybe didn't really have a backstory? Well,
Right.
Nobody really did, but.
Right. And there's in the same way as there are for all of these biblical characters, there is backstory in the sense that people have written it. It's not in the book itself. I was just reading last night all about Abraham, actually, and there's no backstory for him in Genesis. But if you go and look, there's been books and books and books of backstory written for him. At any rate, I think what fascinated me about Vashti was the fact that she, not only there's not much, is not so much the backstory issue, but that she's just disappeared, right? So she is there really to begin to get out of the story to make way for Esther, right? I mean, if you think about it in a storytelling terms, like her whole purpose is to make way for Esther. But I was really drawn to the question of, what happens when you take the absent character and make her present? And also, a really important question, which is like, why was she framed as being so bad when it seems like what she did was stand up to her husband and say, no, I'm not going to walk naked in front of the party? Like, why was she, has she always been or often been painted as a harlot of some kind? That doesn't seem to ring right. And so I think I've really loved books myself as a reader that have taken a kind of maligned or absent character from an earlier story. An example is Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, which takes like the mad woman in the attic from Jane Eyre, and suddenly she's our narrator. there are a lot of books like this that do this. And
Yeah.
I love that feeling as a reader where it's suddenly sort of, I see this character who I only kind of saw at the corner of my eyes, and now I really get to know her. And so that's where I came to Vashti, and I did want to kind of create a more contemporary storyline for her. Like, what would happen if I put Vashti in 1973?
Which was
You
just,
also do eventually meet Vashti in the ancient Persia parts, but I
yeah,
don't want to give away how. Yeah.
no, no, it's great. I mean, which, you do, the character you create for the 1970s is, she's pretty amazing for a woman in the 1970s, what she does. What, so how did you, one of the things that I think is so great about the book is, how all of these women's lives, there's so many similarities between women. You do realize you have these real wide swaths of time, and yet a lot of things have not changed for women, or mothers, or, and, I was reading it and I thought, and one of the things is that, in ancient times, of course, it was such a brutal time. And I thought you really did a good job of painting how women really had few choices, and that any power you had to be very clever about how you wielded it. I mean, and then so I thought that was interesting, seeing inside the palace and outside of the palace. And then the other thing in the 70s, I don't think a lot of people really think about the 70s much anymore. They don't think of it as that far away, yet it's now, nearly, not you, but nearly 50 years. And it was really interesting reading the conversations these women were having, because now we have this arc of about talking about a lot of the same things, and certainly not, and it was so fresh then. And to see these women talking about the ERA and Roe v. Wade, which had just been passed, thinking that was really the future, I thought was fascinating. Certainly in context. Even I was reading this book listening to the Supreme Court hearings, so it had a lot of resonance. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the choices that the differences and the similarities and some of the choices that people had to make? I think that's very interesting. You do begin to see a real there's a lot of similarity. Did Anna, is she with? Oh, there you are.
There we go. Sorry about that. Somehow things got a little glitchy on my end as you were speaking. So can
Okay.
everybody hear me? Just nod. Yes. Okay, great.
Um, did you hear what I mean?
Yes. No, I got it. I got it. So
Okay.
I know, and I did. So I think that it's, one of the things that I realized, and only through the process probably of writing and then rewriting and rewriting, was that one of the things I was following through this kind of these women over time was the way in which their struggle, and to be clear, this is not necessarily true for all groups of women, because like there are women in our world today who are being trafficked, right? Like there are, so this is, I just want to acknowledge that this is a particular group of women, or at least like my contemporary characters are living in quite privileged ways. But for the characters in my book, what I think you see is that their sort of their struggles and their sense of being trapped and their sense of their disempowerment and sense has gone inward. And so, so that when you're in ancient Persia with Esther, she's physically being trapped against her will, right? And then the constraints for Vivian Barr in 1973 are still physical in some ways, but less so. She has more choices, and yet she doesn't. Like, for instance, I mean, the issue you see in that year was the same. This was right after abortion first became legal in New York State, for instance. So you see, like, oh, it's just, some women are starting to gain that power, that choice over their own bodies. You see her like going to a library and looking up instructions for how to send away for a pregnancy test. Like, you really get us, I mean, and so and then you get a sense of who we are in 2016, when the limits on for Lily are many fewer. Like, she can sort of, I mean, legally speaking, for the most part, at least in New York where she lives, she can sort of do what she wants. But a lot of what is stopping her or making things hard for her is her own sort of internalization of the stories she's been told about the life that she should be leading, and the ways in which her experience of that life doesn't match up with what she imagined it would be. And so I do think that that's part of what I'm kind of tracking in a way through the book. And also how important the ways that we tell stories is. I mean, the way that we come to a sense of who we are in the world comes from the stories that we're told, whether, and some of those are the stories we're told through just the way that our family speaks to us at the kitchen table in the morning, right? And some of it is through direct stories. Some of it's through the stories in the religious books that we read. Some of it's stories in the movies that we watch, et cetera, et cetera. The ads that we see. I mean, everything is informing our sense of who we are and who we can be. And so I think, the book on some level is really about that, like storytelling itself, and the power, and also the ways in which sometimes the ways we tell stories, especially in this book, like mother to daughter, have unintended effects. So like Lily's mother really has encouraged her to be what she thinks of as like a strong, independent woman, which to her means like that she's going to be working outside the home, that she is not going to give up her career. And here's Lily, she's made other choices. And like, how can she come to terms with those choices being enough? And not to feel that judgment weighing down on her. And so I wanted to explore that as well. And I think what I often see as the, for all its good intentions, the ways in which feminists themselves or ourselves, that our ideas can be pretty narrow, and limiting in terms of how women conceive of themselves. And so that's all wrapped up in what I was doing.
And it's interesting when you talk about storytelling. There was, in some ways, the Esther story with Lily, when Lily would tell people what the Esther story was, it was almost sort of Shakespearean. It was sort of a story within a story. It had that kind of multi-level piece of storytelling as well. I thought one of the things that was most fascinating was her inner dialogue when she is kind of engaging with a group of women who are really domestic versus what sort of, she's got her feminist group, and then she's got this group of women who, they revel in being in the everyday and homemaking as an art. And of course, there's sort of that, I guess it's post-feminist because people, there is a push-pull between working women and women who choose to stay in the home. And I'm older than you are, but and I've done both. And it is, when I was working, I was incredibly guilty and never felt like I did enough for my kids. And then when I wasn't working, I felt guilty because I was at home and doing other things. And so, that's sort of a reduction of it. But I thought the way that when Lily was in the kitchen she goes over to learn how to sew, and her just, she's just marveling at the fact that her hostess is not using the regular fab reconstituted carrots. She's actually cut carrots up and she has them in ice water, and she was just like gobstopped by this. And and that was so spot on because it was very emblematic of that sort of push pull in a very 21st century way. I thought it was great. And I also loved all of the domestic arts, I guess you would call them, or sewing and laundry, and how you treated those in your book, because there is especially the sewing, because of course that ties back into the costume making and the story of Esther. And right. What happens if I can't buy a store-bought costume? That's wrong. It's
right,
kind of
right.
So can you talk a little bit about that and how you approach it? Because actually I felt like the sewing machine in the middle of the kitchen was almost, the adoration of that was almost that was terrific. It was godlike.
I love that. Yeah, it's so funny as you say the adoration of that. I hadn't thought about this until now, but it could almost be read, I'm just thinking, especially because I was just reading some of this, but like of an idol of a kind, like
yes, that's what it reminded me of, actually.
Right. It's kind of amazing. Yeah. I mean, so I just think I'm fascinated by the ways that women that we sort of divide ourselves and judge ourselves and each other based on these choices that we make around, like, whether, like you were saying, those, and it's true, it's reductive, like, to work, whether am I working at home or am I not? But as we all know, there are all these nuances to that. Like, am I someone who works outside the home, but I'm still committed to always creating, this kind of meal? Or am I, and as we know, right, for all of these advances that were made in the 1970s, in fact, the vast majority of that kind of work is still being done by women, even the women who work as much or more than their husbands, or who earn as much or more than their husbands. And so these are the kinds of ways in which, like, oh wow, there's a lot that hasn't changed. And and so this is partly like my own observation of myself and the ways that we, and what I think of as kind of tribes of women, like the ways that it's very easy, and you see throughout the book in all three parts, you kind of see these tribes. And I think the domestic arts, as you say, is sort of a really fun and clear and really important way or place to kind of see how those divisions manifest, because I think often we do, there's guilt everywhere. It's like you decide to hand make the costume for Halloween, but like you don't know how to do it because no one taught you, and so it turns out really badly. Or you decide to do one thing and it means you don't have time to do another. Everything is trade-offs. And I think for so there's this sense, I really wanted to explore that, those conversations that do, I think, go on in a lot of women's heads. And Lily's, her neurosis is like times 100. Like it's really sort of this like exaggerated version of my own and of other women that I know. But I wanted to kind of play with that and express it in a way that I think captures something really important about this moment. And as you said, that choice, that sort of like retro domestic goddess thing that we've seen in the 21st century, sort of it is post-feminist in that there was the way was paved for it by the fact that women had the choice not to do it, right? And so I think all of these things are just really wrapped up in each other and really complex. And my hope, I mean, what I really wanted in the book, and what I hope especially the end of the book moves toward, is like women finding more connection to each other rather than competition, and finding a way to see past these, what are somewhat pretty superficial divisions, right? Like, oh, so she cuts up her carrots. She takes the time at some point in the day to cut them up and put them in the fridge and put them in ice water. They taste better. Does Lily have to judge her for that? Maybe she could just be like, wow, you know how to do this thing. That's cool. And so I see Lily really does move sort of further from that judgment, that kind of snarky attitude she has at the beginning, toward allowing herself to be more open. And which, of course, ultimately, I think the goal is for her then to be a little more forgiving of herself.
And yeah, and you can see that the processing of that is just magnificent, because we've all been, you've been in situations where everyone has done that themselves, and reading that, you think, yeah, I was probably doing that, and maybe I should take a page from Lily. I particularly like that part. I'm going to kind of shift gears here because there are a lot of different elements in this. I hope I'm not zigzagging too much. One of the things I thought was interesting, kind of getting back to some of getting back to ancient Persia, was you give Esther some magical powers. And that to me was a wonderful, I mean, there's a tradition of that in Jewish literature, like Isaac Bashevis Singer, a lot of, I don't know if you've read a lot of his stories have that little fantastical element that just kind of transports the story. So can you talk a little bit about that? When I was reading that, I thought, oh, this is fabulous. Where is this going? And I like that you made up rules for the magic, kind of, not that it was Harry Potter, but kind of a la, you made your own magical world within ancient Persia.
Yeah, that was really fun for me. I haven't written, I guess, that kind of taken something, that fabulous way of writing in that way. And it happened pretty organically at first, because when I knew when I started writing the ancient Persia parts in the desert outside of the palace where the Hebrews are camped, in their sort of precarious way, this goblin sort of appeared. I mean, it was kind of like in that state. I was just drafting away, and then I was like, why is this goblin here? And then the goblin threw up coins, and one was counterfeit, but one of the boys doesn't know that it's counterfeit, and he takes it to pay for something. And when he pays for it, and then the Persian he gives it to realizes it's counterfeit, that sets off this entire raid on the camp, and really like all the problems for the Hebrews. And so there was this, so suddenly I had created this sort of plot, this very important plot point that relied upon this goblin. And I thought, well, I could still take the goblin away. Like I can find another way to make that happen. So let me think about why I'm doing this. And so I did go back and kind of understand, well, one thing that was very important to me about the ancient Persia parts is that I wanted to make it really clear to my readers, both, Jewish and not, that I was not attempting to sort of recreate, like, here's what it was really like in ancient Persia. That wasn't the kind of book that I was writing. So one way that was, the magic was part of that, became part of that way of kind of indicating we're going into another realm here. Like this is not history. And the first line of that, when you go into ancient Persia, really is a nod at that too. The line is, the camp is as you imagine, which is not to say it is as it was, which was me saying to my reader, like you're always making a contract with your reader, like, okay, come along with me, but this is not, and all the ideas you have about this already come from your own imagination and come from all the books you've read and all the movies you've seen. So anyway, and then what was really interesting to me, so the magic gave me these ways to really play around with power, and women's power in particular, and women's physical power in a really kind of exploded way in those parts. And what I wasn't as familiar with then, I had read some of the Isaac Bashevis Singer stories, but I didn't realize that there really was a tradition going way back to ancient times of practical magic in Judaism. So not just, but not the sort of theoretical magic, I think that's the word I'm looking for, that we see in like Kabbalah, but actually, practical magic. There were sort of ancient manuals in magic that were, best-selling. I don't know what it meant to be best-selling back then, but like best-selling practical magic manuals. And so there was a lot of emphasis on that, and a lot of value given to magic. And so as I learned more about that, I kind of felt even more confidence to kind of develop this in the story.
Yeah, it added just another layer that was just so fun. And it also, I think it was a way for Esther to kind of empower herself a little bit once she was inside the palace.
Right.
And it was interesting, she used it that the Haman character was never named. You kind of kept him sort of like a menacing shadow figure. And then, so was that for a reason, or for him not to become too dominant? He was just sort of in the background, perhaps?
Well, he's pretty dominant in his role. I think it was more to just not give him that particular honor of a name. And then you see later in the book, I have other H's that come in the 70s part and in the contemporary part. They're given names, and that kind of echo. But yeah, it was sort of a clue, or laying that groundwork, but not giving him the name.
And then let's see, the other question I had is, how have this book is a phenomenon, it's broader. I'm sure you have non-Jewish readers and male readers. Have you had, because this is very much a lot of women's issues, it's very much about women and all kinds of different other elements in their relationships and their power. What has your response been from men who have read the book, and also from non-Jewish people who don't know about the Book of Esther or Purim?
Well, so I'll start with the second question. And this, in terms of non-Jewish, it was very important to me to write the book in a way that it would be as accessible to any people who didn't know anything about the Book of Esther, which is not a very well-known book, right? And as far as biblical books go, to ones who did. So, and so one thing that, like, the very opening of the book is kind of a primer Lily's talking to her daughters about the book, and it's also meant to introduce the reader to the book if they don't know it. But it was really important to me. And actually, my editor who bought this book and edited it, she's not Jewish and knew nothing about it. And so that was actually, I was really excited when she loved the book and connected with it in all the ways she did, not knowing anything about it or having any connection to Purim. And so I think that's overall been my experience with sort of non-Jewish audiences, is that there's so much here to connect with that has nothing to do with Judaism or Purim or knowing that tradition. As far as men go, I've had a range. I mean, I've had male readers say, like, this really did help me sort of understand in a way that I haven't what might be going on internally for some of the women in my life. I've had male readers say, well, why don't you spend more time on the male characters? Like, why are they, and my main answer, I guess there are two parts. One is sort of, well, this is about women. It really is. It's a book about women, and that's okay to me. There are a lot of books that have been about men. And the other thing is that I do think there's actually a lot, especially as, again, we get closer, I think I see a lot of questions being raised in this book around how we raise our boys as well, and the stories that men have been told, and the ways in which they trap them as well. So, but that's not where I'm deeply engaged, but I think you can find a lot of evidence in it throughout the book, actually, with every single, starting with Ahasuerus moving to the senator in 1970s, and to Adam, who is Lily's husband, in 2016.
So it's question time, and
Great.
we have a question. This is from a reader who asks about Vivian, and Vivian later in the book she has a short career as a love advice or a columnist. And she asks, why did you choose to make Vivian a love advice columnist? But I'm thinking of the famous, I cannot think of the famous.
Not Dear Abby, but
Dear Abby. Yeah, kind of
Abby.
a Dear Abby type.
Yeah, and her advice does go beyond, I would say, romance. It's sort of very broad, but it's all women. And she, so part of it, this kind of goes back a little bit to the conversation we were having before about tribes and women in different groups. One of the things that really defines Vivian Barr, and kind of plagues her, and that I found most interesting about her, is that she's really caught between groups. She can't seem to figure out, like, she's grown up in this with very clear expectations. Her father was a senator, her grandfather was a governor, her mother, it's very clear who and then she has married a senator, like, this is what you will do, et cetera, et cetera. She feels both very tied to that world and loves it in a lot of ways, and then also has this other part of her that's sort of starting to see it from the outside for the first time. And she's been invited to a couple women's consciousness raising groups that have also been sort of kind of introducing thoughts and questions to her that she hasn't had before. But she's also critical of those women as well. Like, everywhere she looks, she feels both part of, but she can never actually feel fully part of any group. And so part of what her particular column goes, I won't say the name because I think it maybe gives something away, but her column is really it's not a particularly helpful column. It's one in which she's kind of I would say almost like putting back on women the questions that they're asking of her, and saying to them, like, I think in some way, I wouldn't say they're full of despair, but they're not positive. They're not particularly positive.
Which I kind of actually liked. I thought it was kind of refreshing, because you mostly think that a column like that should be much more, a little
encouraging, right? Right. I mean, I've always been fascinated by any kind of advice column. I love them. And I think that it is interesting when you look at some are very encouraging and some are not. And I think the traditional ones often are very critical of the people who write into them. And I was interested in that. And in letting her, someone who's saying, like, well, my mother-in-law is always criticizing me for not being able to keep the house well. And I think maybe I'm just bad. I think maybe I'm just a lazy person. And she's just saying, like, well, take a day and lie down and see how you feel. Maybe you are lazy. Like you'll find out after you lie down for a few days and don't do anything. See, see if it suits you. But anyway, so she's very humorous too, I think.
Yes, and she's got such a great personality. It's just another piece of her that's so
Yeah.
fascinating. Okay, our next question is, if you have in your other books, have you woven Judaism through them?
Yeah, they actually I have. My first book, The Little Bride, is about a Jewish mail order bride in 1880s, in the 1880s, who comes from Ukraine, from Odessa, to the United States and winds up not in New York or Chicago as she imagined she would, but actually in South Dakota, on a farm. There was this whole movement at that time in the United States called Am Olam, to move sort of new Jewish immigrants out to the land that was being opened up, the homesteading land in the West. And it was mostly quite failed. There were all of these agricultural colonies. And this history was something I really didn't know anything about until I started working on the book. And so that's what that book is about. And the second one is set in the 1920s in Gloucester, Massachusetts, actually where I'm speaking to you from today, and is about a young Jewish woman who has a baby out of wedlock and leaves it to be raised by an Irish Catholic woman and her family, and sort of the way in which they are brought back together. It's called Leaving Lucy Pear. And so all of them, I'd say, that book especially, I don't know how much I'm addressing, I would say, the more theological or religious aspects of Judaism, but certainly a lot of the social and cultural aspects and relationships between Jews and other groups. Having grown up in New England myself, or in a place where there were very few Jews, that sort of really informs my sense of myself and my storytelling.
Well, we certainly can appreciate that here because we are a small Jewish community as well, and can certainly relate to that. So let's see. I think we have time for one more question, and it's a great one to kind of close things out. Someone is asking, what are you thinking about working on next?
Whew. I am just barely beginning. I had started something actually in February, and then for reasons that you can imagine, sort of got a little waylaid, and have kind of been moving into a new project. I think all I can say at this point, and again, it may change entirely, and in a few years you might find that I've written a totally different book, but it's sort of informed by the Sarah and Hagar story, but set entirely in contemporary times. And playing around with ideas around surrogacy, international surrogacy in particular. So I think that's the most I can say at this point, not because I want to keep it a secret, but because it's just too nascent.
No, that sounds amazing. Well, unfortunately we've run out of time. We could talk for a whole nother hour because there's so much to explore about the Book of V. I just want to congratulate you on the success of it. It is just it's a wonderful read. I do not know how you got all of that in 300 pages. And I personally couldn't put it down. So I just wanted to thank you for joining us today. I hope everyone has really enjoyed hearing from Anna, and that if you haven't read the book, you will run out right away and purchase it. You can get it from Anna herself, or it's available at Prince Books in downtown Norfolk. And we would love to help out Prince. Independent booksellers are really important, especially now, and especially to help support writers in general. So
I love that you're doing that. And I just wanted to say too, Patty maybe was going to say this, but I did send some signed book plates. So if you buy it from Prince Books, you can get a book plate with my signature on it to put in the front of the book.
Yes.
And I also just say, yay, independent bookstores.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That makes it, that really makes it special. So, again, thank you, everyone. I am going to, and I have a few little plugs for our next, some of our upcoming things. I want to thank everybody who registered today. We had a great turnout, and we put a link to purchase the books in the chat box. to make it easy for you to get the book. And please visit jewishva.org/bookfest for the full lineup of book festival events, including tomorrow's discussion with Jennifer Steinhauer, who has written a book called, she's the author of The Firsts, and she talks about First Amendment issues and actually gives you real advice on how to have a civil conversation with someone who does not agree with you. And it should be a really fantastic chat. So thank you to everybody, and stay healthy, and and have a great afternoon.